There are wolves that howl and wolves that learn to swallow their own sound. Lyra had swallowed hers for 18 years. She knew the exact weight of that silence, not as metaphor, not as the soft, poetic grief that nobles sometimes performed at winter festivals when they recited the old elegies. She knew it as a physical thing, dense and grinding, lodged somewhere beneath her sternum where her wolf used to live, where Senna used to live. The pressure of it had become so constant that she'd stopped calling it pain. Pain implied the possibility of relief. This was simply the architecture of her body now. The locked room behind her ribs, the thing that breathed without breathing, the creature who had once been wild and bright and entirely hers, reduced to a faint and desperate warmth that flared and guttered like a candle in a sealed jar. Don't reach for it, she told herself, the same instruction she gave every morning when she woke on her pallet in the servants' quarters and felt the phantom ache of claws she could no longer claim. Don't reach, don't remember, don't. She reached anyway. She always reached anyway. The kitchens of Shadowmere Keep woke before dawn, and Lyra woke before the kitchens. This was not virtue. This was survival. The understanding, learned early and reinforced often, that the servant who was already working when the head cook arrived was the servant who did not receive the back of a hand across her face before breakfast. She had learned to read the rhythms of this place the way she had once, in another life, learned to read the wind. Not because anyone had taught her, but because her body demanded it. Catalog threat and safety, with an animal precision that her bound wolf could not explain and her human mind could not entirely suppress. The fire needed stoking. She stoked it. The water needed hauling from the well in the outer courtyard. 3 trips with the heavy iron yoke across her shoulders, the cold of the pre-dawn air biting at her neck above the servant's cloth she kept wrapped tight around her hair. She hauled it. The bread needed setting. She set it. Her hands moved through these tasks with the automatic competence of long practice, and her mind went elsewhere, as it always did during the mindless hours, drifting back through the years to the girl she had been before the poison in her father's cup, before Margot's hands, cold and deliberate, pressing her down into the ritual circle drawn in ash and silver on the stone floor of the Ashenbrand estate, before the sound she could not forget, would never forget, the sound of her own wolf screaming as the binding closed around her like a fist. Senna had screamed. Lyra had screamed. And then the binding had sealed them both into silence, and the world had continued without them. Stop, she told herself. The bread dough required attention. She gave it attention. It was Mira who told her, breathless and bright-eyed, arriving at the kitchen door with her cap askew and her cheeks flushed from running. Mira, who was the only person in Shadowmere Keep who spoke to Lyra as though she were a person rather than a useful piece of furniture. Mira, who was 17 and still believed that things could be interesting rather than dangerous. He's here, Mira said, and the way she said it, hushed, reverent, slightly terrified, told Lyra everything about who he was before the next words came. The Alpha King. He arrived in the night. He's called a full assembly of the household for the 7th bell. Lyra's hands did not stop moving. She pressed the heel of her palm into the dough and felt it yield, and she did not look up, and she did not let her face do anything at all. Then we'll be needed in the great hall, she said, for the assembly bread will require, Lyra. Mira's hand caught her wrist, and the touch was gentle but urgent. Did you hear what I said? The Alpha King, Kale Stormborn. They say he's come to conduct the pre-coronation inspection himself. They say he's... She stopped, swallowed. They say he's not what the stories make him. They always say that, Lyra thought, and the stories are always right. She said, Yeah, I heard you. 7th bell. We should prepare the assembly trays. Mira released her wrist and stepped back, and Lyra felt the girl's disappointment like a small, warm weight. She was sorry for it. She was always sorry for the small disappointments she caused the people who tried to reach her, and she was never able to stop causing them, because the alternative was letting them reach her, and she had learned, at 16, on a stone floor, with her wolf screaming still echoing in her bones. What happened to the things she allowed herself to love? The 7th bell rang, and Shadowmere Keep assembled. Lyra stood in the back row of the servants' formation, which was where she always stood, which was where she preferred to stand. The great hall of the keep was a cathedral of black stone and silver-veined marble, the ceiling lost in shadow, the walls hung with the banners of every pack that had bent the knee to the Stormborn line. Torches burned in iron brackets, and their light fell in long amber columns across the assembled household. Ranked warriors at the front, advisors and stewards behind them, and then the servants in their gray, a tide of lowered heads and careful stillness. She kept her own head lowered. She studied the flagstones. She noticed with the part of her mind that never stopped cataloging that the stone directly before her left foot had a crack running through it in the shape of a question mark, and she thought, distantly, that this seemed appropriate. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps. His footsteps were nearly silent, which was wrong for a man of his size, which told her something about the degree of control he exercised over his own body. What she heard was the change in the room, the collective intake of breath, the subtle shift in the quality of the silence, as though the air itself had reorganized around a new gravitational center, and then his scent reached her. She was not prepared for it. She had not been prepared for it, because she had not known she could still be reached that way. Her wolf was bound, her senses were muted, and for 18 years the world had smelled only of ash and iron and the mundane human layers of a keep full of bodies. She had forgotten what it was to be reached by a scent. This reached her, dark and clean, like the air in the moment before lightning strikes. That specific charge, that specific electricity, that held breath quality of the world bracing for something enormous, and underneath it, warmer, something she had no name for, something that pressed against the locked room behind her ribs with a force that made her breath stutter and catch and nearly break. No, she thought, and the word was not a thought so much as a reflex, a survival mechanism firing before she could examine what it was responding to. No. Whatever that is, no. Senna moved. Lyra felt it like a physical blow, the sudden, violent surge of her bound wolf pressing against the binding with a force she had not felt in years. Not since the early days when the pain was still fresh, and Senna still believed that struggling would accomplish something. The pressure behind her ribs became a roar, became a heat, became something that climbed her spine and pressed behind her eyes, and she locked every muscle in her body against it and stared at the cracked flagstone and breathed through her nose in slow, controlled increments. "Be still," she told Senna. "Be still! Be still! Be still!" The warmth subsided. The pressure remained. It would always remain. She did not look up when he passed. She was very careful not to look up when he passed because she understood, with the animal certainty that her bound wolf still managed to transmit, that looking up would be a mistake she could not undo. She watched his shadow instead, the shadow of a man who moved like something that had never needed to learn how to be dangerous, because it had simply always been, and she watched it pass, and she breathed, and she was invisible. She had been invisible for 18 years. She was very good at it. But in the moment his shadow crossed her feet, something happened that she could not explain and would spend the following days trying to forget. The crack in the flagstone, the question mark crack, seemed to catch the torchlight differently. A trick of the angle, a coincidence of flame and stone, nothing more. She told herself it was nothing more. Senna, silent and bound and burning, did not agree. The assembly ended. The servants dispersed. Lyra carried her trays and lowered her head and moved through the great hall with the careful, practiced invisibility of a woman who had made herself into a ghost by necessity. And she did not think about the scent that still clung to the air, and she did not think about the wolf pressing against her ribs like a tide against a seawall, and she did not think about the shadow that had crossed her feet like a question she was not permitted to answer. She thought about the bread. She thought about the seventh bell. She thought about the cracked flagstone and the shape of the crack, and the way some questions have a way of persisting even when you refuse to ask them. Don't reach, she told herself. Senna reached anyway. She always reached anyway. Invisibility was a skill, not a condition. Lyra had learned this the way she had learned everything in the years since Shadowmere Keep had become her world, through repetition, through pain, through the slow grinding away of everything that might make her memorable. She rose before the kitchen fires were lit. This was the first rule of disappearing. Be present before anyone thinks to look for you, so that your presence becomes part of the architecture, as unremarkable as the stone walls or the iron hooks where the copper pots hung in descending order of size. She had been the one to arrange those pots. She had been the one to sweep the ash from the hearth and carry the water from the well and set the bread to rise in the dark hours before dawn, when Shadowmere Keep breathed slow and deep around her, and she could almost pretend, for the length of a single exhale, that she was the only living thing in it. Almost. The keep was never truly quiet. She had learned that too. It breathed. It groaned. The ancient black stone contracted in the cold and expanded in the rare warmth of afternoon. and the sound it made was something between a sigh and a warning, a low, structural complaint that she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. The silver veins in the marble of the great corridors above her head conducted sound the way rivers conducted water, carrying whispers from one end of the fortress to the other, so that she sometimes heard fragments of conversations she was never meant to hear. A lord's argument with his steward, a guard's confession to his sleeping bunkmate, the particular silence of a room where something terrible had recently been decided. She did not listen, or rather, she listened the way she did everything now, carefully and without appearing to. The bread was her first task. She worked the dough with hands that knew the motion so thoroughly they required no direction from her mind, which was free to do what it always did in the quiet hours. Catalog. The number of new guards on the eastern corridor. 3 more than yesterday, which meant a dignitary had arrived or was expected. The smell of tallow candles burning in the upper floors since before she woke. Someone had been awake all night, someone with rank enough to waste candles. The particular quality of tension in the kitchen staff when she had arrived, the way Berta the head cook had snapped at the scullery boy for breathing too loudly, which meant Berta had received instructions that frightened her. Something is happening. The thought arrived without urgency. Something was always happening in Shadowmere Keep. The Alpha King's court was a living organism, and organisms were always in the process of becoming something other than what they had been. She had learned to observe the changes the way one observed weather, with attention, but without investment, because investment was the first step toward caring, and caring was the first step toward being noticed, and being noticed was the first step toward everything she had spent 18 years preventing. She shaped the loaves with practiced hands and slid them into the oven and turned to the next task, and the next, and the one after that. This was the second rule of disappearing. Keep moving. A still servant was a servant someone might look at. A moving servant was furniture. By the time the kitchen came alive around her, Berta barking orders, the younger girls clattering pots, the delivery boy arriving with the morning slaughter from the outer village, Lyra had already completed 3 hours of work and positioned herself at the far end of the preparation table, where the light was worst and the angle from the doorway made her difficult to see. She chopped vegetables. She did not look up. She did not speak unless spoken to, and she had arranged, over the course of years, to be spoken to as rarely as possible. Greta arrived at the 7th hour. Lyra felt her before she heard her, a particular quality of attention, sharp and acquisitive, that prickled along the back of her neck the way a change in air pressure preceded a storm. She kept her eyes on the carrots beneath her knife. She kept her breathing even. She kept her face arranged in the expression she had perfected over years of practice, not blank, which attracted suspicion, but pleasantly absent, the face of a woman whose thoughts were no more complex than the task in front of her. Don't look at her. Don't give her anything to carry back. Greta was Margot's eyes in this place. Lyra had known this for 11 of her 18 years here, had identified it in the way Greta watched her with a specific, hungry attention that had nothing to do with the normal cruelties of a senior servant toward a junior one. Greta reported. Lyra did not know the full content of those reports, but she understood their purpose, to confirm again and again that Lyra Ashenbrand remained exactly what she appeared to be, a nobody, a nothing, a girl with no wolf and no name and no future worth protecting. She kept chopping. Greta moved through the kitchen with the proprietary ease of someone who believed herself important, pausing to criticize the scullery boy's work, to steal a piece of bread from the cooling rack with the casual entitlement of a woman who had never been hungry enough to count. Her gaze swept the room in a practiced arc. It landed on Lyra. It stayed. Lyra felt the weight of it like a hand pressed flat against her back. She did not react. This was the 3rd rule, the hardest rule, the one that had cost her the most to learn. Do not react to being watched. A person who flinches under observation is a person who has something to hide. A person who continues chopping carrots with the same mechanical rhythm, who does not tighten her shoulders or quicken her breath or betray by any flicker of her face that she is aware of the attention. That person is invisible. She was very good at being invisible. The morning passed. The bread came out. The dignitary's breakfast was assembled on silver trays and carried upstairs by the ranked servants, the ones who were permitted to enter the upper floors. Lyra was not among them. She had never been permitted above the 2nd level, which suited her precisely. The upper floors were where the Alpha King moved, and the Alpha King was the one thing in Shadowmere Keep that she could not afford to be near. She had seen him only twice in 18 years. The first time she had been new here, 16, and raw with grief and the fresh agony of the binding, which in those early months had felt like being slowly crushed from the inside, like her ribs were a cage, and something inside them was pressing outward with every breath. She had been carrying water from the well when his procession had passed through the outer courtyard, a column of mounted warriors in black and silver, and at their head a figure on a gray horse who had seemed, to her 16-year-old eyes, less like a man than like a weather event. She had not seen his face. She had only seen the way the guards around her had gone still, the way even the horses in the stable had quieted, and she had thought, this is what power looks like when it doesn't need to announce itself. The second time had been 3 years ago. A kitchen fire, quickly contained, but in the chaos she had been pushed into a corridor she was not supposed to occupy, and he had come around a corner with 2 of his advisors and nearly walked into her. She had pressed herself against the wall and looked at the floor and held every part of herself motionless, and he had passed within 2 feet of her without pausing. She had not breathed for a full minute after he disappeared. She had told herself it was fear. It was easier that way. Don't think about that. Don't think about him. The thought arrived with the particular sharpness of a warning she had given herself many times before, which meant it was a thought she kept having, which meant she was not as successfully not thinking about him as she preferred to believe. She pressed her lips together and focused on the onions she was now cutting, which gave her eyes a convenient reason to water. Behind her ribs, in the place where Senna lived, where Senna had always lived, locked and silent and aching, something shifted. It was subtle. It was the difference between a held breath and a released one, between stillness and the faintest tremor of motion. Lyra had felt it before, the occasional restless press of her wolf against the binding, the phantom sensation of claws that could not manifest, the ghost of a howl that never reached her throat. She had learned to absorb these moments without reacting, to let them pass through her the way pain passes through a body that has learned not to fight it. But this was different. This was not the familiar ache of suppression. This was directional, as though Senna were not simply pressing against her cage, but orienting toward something, the way a compass needle swings toward north with a certainty that has nothing to do with the needle's own desire and everything to do with the nature of what it is built to find. Lyra set down her knife. She pressed one hand flat against the preparation table, steadying herself against a vertigo that had no physical cause. Around her, the kitchen continued its noise and motion, indifferent to the fact that something inside her had just moved for the first time in 18 years. "What are you reaching for?" she asked the silence behind her ribs. Senna did not answer. Senna never answered, but the pressure remained, that new, directional quality, that sense of orientation towards something she could not see or name or afford to want. From somewhere above her, deep in the upper corridors of the keep, she heard a door close. The sound traveled through the silver-veined marble, arriving in the kitchen as barely more than a vibration, a single, resonant note that she felt in her back teeth and the soles of her feet. She picked up her knife. She began to chop again. She was very good at being invisible. She was beginning to suspect that this would not be enough. She had learned over 18 years of careful survival that the safest place in any room was the edge of it, not the corner. Corners trapped you, left you with nowhere to move when trouble arrived. And trouble in Shadowmere Keep arrived with the regularity of tides. No, the edge was better. The periphery. The place where the candlelight thinned and the shadows thickened and a girl in gray could become, if she was careful enough, simply part of the architecture. Lyra had become very good at being architecture. She moved along the far wall of the great hall now, a tray of emptied goblets balanced against her hip, her eyes fixed on the middle distance in the particular way she had perfected, seeing everything, appearing to see nothing. The hall was full tonight, more full than it had been in months, the long tables crowded with lords and warriors and visiting dignitaries who had arrived in a procession of horses and banners that morning, their voices filling the courtyard like a flock of agitated starlings. "The coronation preparations," Mira had whispered over the bread kneading that dawn. 7 weeks, she'd said, and her voice had carried the particular weight of a woman who understood what 7 weeks meant. Lyra understood too. She simply could not afford to think about it. Don't think about it. Move, be useful, be invisible. She skirted the edge of a cluster of warriors, dipping her head as one of them gestured broadly and nearly caught her with his elbow. He didn't notice her. None of them did. She was the gray girl, the quiet one, the servant with the careful hands and the downcast eyes. She had worn this disguise so long, it had begun to feel like skin. What she had not accounted for, in all her careful years of practiced invisibility, was him. She felt the Alpha King before she saw him. That was the only honest way to describe it. A shift in the quality of the air, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the drafts that moved through Shadowmere's ancient stones. The hair along her forearms rose. The thing behind her ribs, the locked, aching, impossible thing that she refused to name, pressed suddenly against its chains with a force that stole her breath. No! Absolutely not! Stop! She pressed the tray harder against her hip and kept walking. He was at the high table, of course. He was always at the high table, raised on its dais above the rest of the hall, positioned so that every person in the room could see him, and so that he could, if he chose, see every person in return. She had spent 2 weeks in this hall and had never once made the mistake of looking directly at him. She had catalogued him only in fragments, the way you might observe a fire, in glances, from angles, never straight on, because straight on was how you got burned. But tonight something was different, and she could not immediately identify what. She reached the end of the hall and turned to make her way back toward the kitchens. And that was when she understood. The hall had gone quieter, not silent. The conversation continued. The laughter continued. But the particular frequency of the room had shifted, the way a forest shifts when a predator moves through it. Every creature in the space had recalibrated, unconsciously, toward a single point. She made the mistake of following their attention. He was standing. That was the first thing she registered, that he had risen from his seat at the high table and was moving, descending from the dais with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never needed to hurry because the world arranged itself around his pace. He was speaking to Lord Vane at his shoulder, his head inclined slightly, and she had one clear moment to observe the line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his brow, the breadth of him in the black ceremonial coat that seemed designed to remind everyone in the room that he was not merely a man who held power, but a man who was made of it. Then his eyes moved. They swept the room in the automatic, assessing way of a predator, not searching for anything in particular, simply maintaining awareness of everything. And they crossed her. She looked away. Immediately, instinctively, the way you look away from lightning. He didn't see you. You are architecture. You are a tray and a gray dress and nothing else. She walked. Her feet knew the path to the kitchens. She didn't need to think about it. She focused on the weight of the goblets against her hip, the sound of her own footsteps on the stone floor, the distant clatter of the kitchen beyond the far door. She focused on anything except the sensation crawling up the back of her neck. The specific, unmistakable prickling of being watched. She did not look back. She made it through the kitchen door and set the tray down on the long wooden table with hands that were, she noticed distantly, not entirely steady. Mira glanced up from the fire, took one look at her face, and said nothing, which was one of the things Lyra valued most about Mira. The woman had an extraordinary capacity for strategic silence. It was nothing, Lyra told herself. His eyes moved across the room. That is what eyes do. You were not seen. But Senna, her wolf, her bound and buried wolf, who had not spoken to her in years, who existed now only as pressure and pain, and the occasional phantom sensation of fur she could not grow. Senna pressed against the binding with a force that made Lyra's knees want to buckle, not in warning, not in fear, in recognition. Don't, Lyra thought, and the word was aimed inward, fierce and desperate. Whatever you think you know, don't. We cannot afford it. The pressure subsided, but it did not disappear. She returned to the hall 3 more times that evening because the work required it, and because disappearing would draw more attention than remaining. She kept to the edges. She kept her eyes down. She was careful and methodical, and she almost convinced herself that the first moment had been coincidence. Then the second moment happened. She was clearing a section of the lower tables, the work of her hands automatic, her mind carefully blank, when she became aware that the conversation near her had stopped. Not the whole hall, just the small cluster of lords to her left, who had been arguing about something to do with the northern border, and who had gone abruptly silent in the particular way that people go silent when someone of consequence approaches. She did not look up. She heard his footsteps. She had never consciously catalogued the sound of his footsteps before, but she recognized them now with a certainty that frightened her, a steady, unhurried rhythm, each step carrying a weight that was not merely physical. The stone floor seemed to register him differently than it registered everyone else, as though even the architecture of Shadowmere Keep acknowledged his authority. He stopped. Nearby. Too nearby. She kept her eyes on the table. She reached for another goblet. Sleeve it. His voice was... She had no adequate framework for his voice. She had heard it across the hall, at a distance, filtered through the noise of crowds, and even then it had done something to the air around it, some quality of resonance that she had attributed to the acoustics of the stone room. Up close it was something else entirely, low and precise and unhurried, with a texture like the moment before a storm commits to breaking, charged and still and inevitable all at once. She left the goblet. She straightened. She kept her eyes down, fixed on the middle button of his coat, which was the highest point she could manage without looking at his face. "Look at me!" I would rather not, she thought, and the thought was so honest and so helpless that she almost said it aloud. She looked up. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of winter sky or the pale gray of ash, a harder gray, the gray of flint, of storm water, of something that had been tested and had not broken. They were fixed on her with an attention that felt, absurdly, like being taken apart and examined, each piece held to the light before being set aside. She held his gaze for exactly as long as she could manage, which was not very long at all. "So you were in the hall earlier," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord." Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "You moved to assist Lord Carew when he was taken ill." She had. Lord Carew had gone pale and clammy at the far end of the table, and she had been close, and her hands had known before her mind did, had reached for his wrist, had pressed there, and the color had begun to return to his face within moments. She had thought no one had noticed. She had been wrong. "I brought him water," she said, and loosened his collar. He seemed to need air. Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth. She would not call it warmth, but a shift, a recalibration, the way a predator adjusts its assessment of something it initially dismissed. "So what is your name?" "Don't give him anything real. Don't give him anything he can hold." "So Lyra?" she said. "Just Lyra. No lineage, no surname, nothing that could be traced or recognized. The name her father had given her, stripped of everything her father had meant." He said nothing for a moment. The silence between them had a texture she could not describe, dense and strange, like the air pressure before a storm, like something gathering itself. Then, "So you may go." She went. She walked back toward the kitchens with measured steps, and she did not run, and she did not look back, and she did not allow herself to feel the way Senna was pressing against her ribs like a creature who had just scented something it had been searching for across a very long and terrible distance. She did not allow herself to feel any of it. She was very nearly successful. She had learned, over 18 years of servitude, that the safest place in any room was the edge of it, not the corner. Corners trapped you, left you nowhere to move when trouble arrived, and trouble always arrived in Shadowmere Keep wearing the face of someone important. The edge was different. The edge gave you the wall at your back and the whole room spread before you, every entrance and exit mapped in the first 3 seconds of entering, a habit so old she no longer knew she was doing it. She simply stood where she stood and knew, without thinking, exactly how far she was from the door. Tonight, the great hall blazed with the kind of light that cost more than she earned in a year. 40 candelabras. She had counted them while setting the tables, her hands moving through the familiar motions of placement, goblet here, knife there, the folded cloth precisely so, while her mind catalogued everything else. The visiting delegation from the eastern reaches, 12 of them, seated at the long table's far end, their clothing the deep burgundy of House Carath. Lord Vane at the Alpha King's right hand. As always, his narrow face arranged in an expression of pleasant attention that she had learned, over months of watching, meant he was listening to something other than the conversation in front of him. Don't look at the head of the table. Don't look at him. She looked. She couldn't help it. She had not been able to help it since the morning 3 days ago, when she'd rounded a corridor corner and walked directly into the wall of his presence. Not his body. He had been 10 feet away, and her bound wolf had thrown itself against its chains so violently that she'd had to grip the stone wall to stay upright. Since then, her body had developed a traitorous awareness of him that operated entirely without her consent. She knew when he entered a room before she heard the doors. She knew when he turned his gaze in her direction before the heat of it reached her skin. She knew the precise distance between them at any given moment the way she knew her own heartbeat. Not by counting, but by feeling. This is dangerous. This is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to you, and you have survived a great many dangerous things. She pulled her attention back to the wine jug in her hands and moved along the edge of the room. The dinner had been proceeding for 2 hours. She had refilled goblets, carried platters, kept her eyes down, and her footsteps silent, and she had almost convinced herself that tonight would pass like every other night, unremarkable and survivable. Then she saw Lord Carath's hands. He was the head of the Eastern delegation, a broad man of perhaps 50, with the silver-streaked hair of an old-blood alpha and the particular stillness of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. He had been speaking with animation when she'd last passed his end of the table. Now his hands lay flat against the tablecloth, and something about their stillness was wrong in a way she felt before she understood. That's not stillness. That's effort. She stopped. She was supposed to keep moving. Greta's eyes were on her from across the room, always on her, always looking for the infraction that would earn Lyra a punishment. But her feet had stopped of their own accord, and her attention narrowed to the man at the far end of the table with the focused precision of a hawk dropping from height. His color had changed. She could see it even in the candlelight, the particular grayness moving beneath his skin like something spreading. His breathing had shallowed. The man beside him was still talking, oblivious, and Lord Carath was still nodding, performing health with the desperate concentration of a man who knew something was wrong and had not yet decided whether to admit it. Poison. She didn't know how she knew. She had never been trained as a healer, had never studied the old arts, had no formal knowledge of toxicology or dark craft. But the knowledge arrived in her body the way cold arrived, not as a thought but as a certainty, immediate and physical, settling into her bones before her mind could question it. The man was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the quiet efficiency of something designed to look like illness. And if she did not move in the next 30 seconds, he would be beyond the reach of anything she could offer. If you move, they will see you. If they see you, Greta will report it. If Greta reports it, she was already moving. She crossed the room with the wine jug still in her hands, because a servant with a wine jug had a reason to approach any table, and she kept her face blank and her pace unhurried even as everything inside her screamed to run. She reached Lord Carath's chair and leaned forward to refill his goblet. A perfectly ordinary gesture, invisible, the kind of thing that happened a dozen times a night. And as she did, her free hand dropped to his forearm. She had not planned the touch. Her hand simply went where it needed to go. The moment her fingers closed around his wrist, she felt it. The poison moving through his blood like cold fire, a dark thread winding toward his heart. Her raven gift, the thing she had no name for, the ability that had surfaced in fragments over years without explanation, surged up through her palm and into him before she could stop it, or question it, or be afraid of it. Heat moved through her hand. She felt the dark thread resist, felt it push back against her, and she pressed harder with something that was not strength but will, something older than training, something that lived in the part of her that remembered being a daughter of the Ashenbrand line before that name was taken from her. The thread frayed, dissolved. Lord Carath drew a breath that was noticeably deeper than the one before it, and the gray beneath his skin began, slowly, to recede. She straightened. She moved away. She had been at his side for perhaps 8 seconds. She was halfway back to the wall when she felt the weight of a gaze land on her like a hand on her shoulder, specific, deliberate, unmistakable. Not Greta's surveillance, which she knew the texture of the way she knew the texture of her own calluses. Something else. Something that made the bound wolf behind her ribs go absolutely, terrifyingly still. Don't look. Don't look. Do not! She looked. Kyle Stormborn was watching her. Not the polite, sweeping attention of a ruler cataloging his household. Not the absent gaze of a man whose eyes had happened to land in her direction. He was watching her the way she watched exits, with full, focused, deliberate attention, as if she were the most important piece of information in the room, and he was trying to understand what she meant. Her lungs forgot their function. She had been close to him before, close enough to serve, close enough to feel the particular quality of the air around him, that charged stillness that preceded lightning. But she had never been the object of his attention, not directly, not like this. The distance between them was perhaps 20 feet, and it felt like nothing. It felt like he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she should be able to feel his breath. He saw. He saw what you did. He saw your hand on Carath's wrist, and he saw the man's color change. And now he is looking at you, and he is not the kind of man who looks at things without understanding them. She dropped her gaze to the floor. She made herself breathe. She counted the stones beneath her feet. 3, 4, 5. And she thought about the cold and the dark and the small room she slept in and all the reasons she had survived this long, which were silence, invisibility, and the absolute refusal to be interesting to anyone who held power over her. But her hand was still warm. The warmth spread up her wrist and into her arm and settled somewhere near her collarbone, and her bound wolf had stopped throwing itself against its chains and was instead doing something she had not felt it do in years, perhaps ever. It was pressing forward, not in desperation, but in recognition. As if it had heard a sound it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting, and was now leaning toward the source with the whole of its silent, suffering body. "Stop! Stop that! You stop that right now!" Senna did not stop. Senna pressed, and the warmth in Lyra's chest spread wider, and she stood at the edge of the room with her wine jug and her calloused hands and her servant's cloth, and she understood with the particular clarity that only arrives when something is already too late to prevent, that she had made a mistake tonight. Not the healing. She could not regret the healing. Lord Careth was breathing, and the thread of dark craft that had been winding toward his heart was gone, and she would make that choice again in the same 8 seconds without hesitation. The mistake was simpler and more catastrophic than that. She had been seen, not as a servant, not as a shadow at the edge of someone else's story. She had been seen as whatever she actually was, the thing beneath the gray cloth and the careful silence and the 18 years of practiced diminishment. And the man who had seen her was the one man in all of Shadowmere Keep who had both the power to destroy her and the intelligence to understand what he'd witnessed. She did not look at him again. She moved to the far side of the room, and she kept her breathing even, and she did not allow herself to feel the weight of his gaze as it followed her. Slowly, deliberately, the way a predator tracks something it has not yet decided whether to pursue. She told herself she had not felt it. Her wolf, pressed warm and aching against its chains, knew better. She had learned, over 18 years, to read the silence between heartbeats. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room, nor the weighted silence of held breath before a storm, but the specific surgical silence of a body at war with itself, the silence of a wolf that could not howl, the silence of Senna, pressing against the inside of her ribs like a fist against a locked door, rhythmic and relentless, and entirely without hope of answer. Tonight that silence had changed its quality. Something is different, Lyra thought, and the thought frightened her more than the usual pain did. She stood at the long stone basin in the lower kitchens, her hands submerged in water that had long since gone cold, scrubbing the residue from the evening service off the great copper pots. The kitchen had emptied an hour ago. Even Greta had retreated, though Lyra had felt the woman's eyes on her back for most of the evening, that particular quality of attention that was less observation and more inventory. Greta counted things. Counted Lyra's movements, her words, the number of times her gaze lifted toward the great hall. Lyra had learned to give her nothing worth counting, but now the kitchen was empty, and the fire had burned low, and the silence was wrong. Senna was not pressing. Senna was reaching. The distinction was everything. For 18 years, the wolf inside her had pushed against the binding with the blind, exhausted desperation of something that had forgotten what it was pushing toward, only that it must push, only that stopping meant dying. There was no direction to it. There was no want in it, only the raw, animal refusal to be extinguished. Lyra had grown so accustomed to that particular quality of ache that she had stopped feeling it as pain and started feeling it as weather. It was simply the atmosphere of her interior life, constant, directionless, hers. This was different. Senna was reaching toward something. Lyra lifted her hands from the water and stood very still. The cold dripped from her fingers onto the stone floor in a small, irregular percussion. Drip, drip, pause, drip. And she focused on that sound with the deliberate attention of someone who has learned that the body can be managed if you give it something small to hold on to. The dripping, the cold, the rough texture of the stone beneath her bare feet. Don't, she told herself. Don't reach back. But her body had already turned. She was facing the corridor that led up from the kitchens toward the great hall, toward the upper levels of the keep, toward wherever he was at this hour. She had not decided to turn. Her feet had simply reoriented, as if north had shifted. She had felt it 3 times now, this involuntary reorientation. The first time 2 days ago, when he had passed through the corridor outside the linen room where she was folding cloth, and she had pressed herself against the wall and felt her pulse do something architectural, not simply quicken, but restructure, as if it had been beating in the wrong rhythm her entire life and had only just now found the correct one. The second time, yesterday evening, when she had carried a tray of wine into the antechamber, and he had been standing with his back to her at the window, and the late light had done something to the line of his shoulders that she had immediately forbidden herself to catalogue, and Senna had surged so violently against the binding that Lyra had nearly dropped the tray. The third time was now. He was somewhere above her. She knew it the way she knew weather, not through thought, but through the body's older intelligence, the part of her that had been a wolf before it had been a servant, before it had been afraid. Stop, she told that part of herself. You don't get to do this. You don't get to want things. She crossed to the fire and added wood to it, not because the kitchen needed warmth, but because she needed something to do with her hands. The wood caught slowly, and she watched the flame find its shape, and she breathed the smell of wood smoke and cold stone and the ghost of the evening's roasted meat. And she tried to locate herself in the ordinary sensory texture of her life. It didn't work, because underneath all of it, underneath the smoke and the cold and the grease, she could smell him, even from here, even through 2 floors of stone and a dozen closed doors. His scent had been in the great hall when she'd carried the wine through, and it had lodged itself somewhere in her memory with the tenacity of a splinter. Dark amber and cold iron, and something underneath, both of those things that she had no name for, something that made the back of her throat ache with a recognition she refused to examine. "You've smelled powerful alphas before," she reminded herself. "You've served in this keep for 3 years. There have been visiting lords, warriors, pack leaders. None of them did this to you. None of them had made Senna reach. The fire had caught properly now, and the kitchen filled with the small domestic sounds of settling wood and shifting ash." Lyra sat back on her heels and pressed one hand flat against her sternum, a habit she'd developed in the early years of the binding, when the pain had been acute enough to double her over. Now it was less a response to pain and more a way of checking in, of confirming that Senna was still there, still alive, still hers. The wolf's response was immediate and unmistakable, a pulse of warmth moving outward from the binding center like a stone dropped in still water. Not pain, not the usual desperate pressure, something else entirely, something that felt with a terrifying specificity like recognition. Lyra's hand pressed harder against her chest. "Don't!" she whispered aloud, to the empty kitchen, to the wolf inside her, to herself. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped thin by the effort of the day and the effort of the evening and the effort of 3 years of being no one, wanting nothing, surviving. The warmth didn't recede. "He doesn't know you exist," she told herself. "He walked through the great hall tonight, and his eyes moved over you the way eyes move over furniture. You are a servant. You are a gray cloth and a lowered head and a pair of hands that carry things. You are not—" But she stopped herself there, because finishing that sentence required her to say what she actually was, and she had learned the hard way that naming things gave them weight, and weight was dangerous, and she could not afford the luxury of being anything other than invisible. She stood. She dried her hands on the rough cloth at her belt. She did not look at the corridor that led upward. She looked at it anyway. The stone passage was dark beyond the kitchen's firelight, and the darkness had that particular quality of late-night keeps, thick and listening, as if the walls themselves were paying attention. Somewhere above, a door closed. The sound traveled down through the stone in a way that she felt more than heard, a low reverberation that moved through the soles of her feet and up through her spine and arrived in her chest as something that Senna answered with another of those terrible warm pulses. Stop it, Lyra thought, and the thought had no force behind it at all. Because here was the thing she had not allowed herself to think directly, the thing she had been circling for 2 days with the careful, wide berth of someone who knows where the trap is buried. Senna had not responded to another living being in 18 years. Not to the other servants, not to the visiting lords, not to the pack warriors who moved through the keep with their alpha-adjacent power and their aggressive, territorial sense. The binding had silenced her so completely that Lyra had sometimes wondered, in the darkest hours, whether Senna was still truly alive in there, or whether what she felt was only the memory of a wolf, an echo, a ghost pressing against the walls of a house it no longer inhabited. But Senna was responding now. Senna was reaching now. And the only thing that had changed, the only variable that was new, was him. Don't think it, Lyra warned herself, even as the thought completed itself with the quiet, devastating certainty of something that had always been true and was only now being acknowledged. Don't you dare think it! She thought it! The Alpha King was the reason her wolf was waking up. The fire popped behind her, a sharp report in the silence, and she startled, actually startled, her whole body flinching with a reflexive animal alertness that she immediately suppressed, smoothing her expression back into the blank, serviceable calm she wore like armor. Her heart was loud in her own ears. The cold of the stone floor had moved up through her feet and into her ankles, and she noticed, with the detached precision of someone cataloging damage, that her hands were trembling. Not from cold. If he sees you, she thought, you are already lost. If Senna breaks the binding, if anyone in this keep discovers what you are, Margot will know within a fortnight, and Margot will not let you live long enough to explain yourself. The logic was sound. The logic was the same logic that had kept her alive for 18 years, the same logic that had taught her to be invisible, to be small, to be nothing. The logic did not stop her wolf from reaching. Lyra pressed her hand against her sternum one final time, feeling the pulse of warmth beneath her palm. Senna, alive and reaching and terrifyingly awake, and she made herself a promise in the cold and the firelight and the late-night silence of the keep. She would be more careful. She would be more invisible. She would give him nothing to notice, nothing to remember, nothing to see. She was already afraid it was too late. There are rituals older than the keep itself, older than the bloodlines that built it, older than the names carved into the black stone walls of the great hall. Lyra had heard of the ritual of recognition the way she had heard of most things in Shadowmere, in fragments, in whispers, in the careful silences between servants who knew better than to speak too loudly about what the nobles did in the dark. She had not expected to be standing inside one. How does a person end up here? She thought, her hands folded in front of her, the question more genuine than rhetorical. How does a kitchen girl end up standing in the inner sanctum while the Alpha King's court assembles around her like a closing fist? The answer, of course, was Mira. Sweet, reckless Mira, who had been summoned to serve the ritual wine and had twisted her ankle on the back stairs, and who had looked up at Lyra with those enormous frightened eyes and said please in a voice that Lyra had never learned to refuse. The answer was that Lyra had taken her place. The answer was that no one had checked the face beneath the servant's cloth, because no one ever checked the faces of servants. Until now. The sanctum was a circular room carved directly into the mountain's heart, its walls unfinished stone veined with silver that caught the torchlight and threw it back in fractured pieces. The floor was cold beneath her feet. She had removed her shoes at the threshold, as required, and the stone pulled the warmth from her soles with a patient, deliberate thoroughness. Around the room's perimeter stood the court. 12 ranked wolves, 6 on each side, their formal gray cloaks pooling at their feet, their eyes forward. They were not looking at her. They were looking at him. Kyle stood at the room's center. She had seen him at a distance before, across the great hall, through doorways, once in the courtyard when she had been carrying water and had pressed herself against the wall to let his procession pass. Distance had been a mercy. Distance had allowed her to observe him, the way one observes a storm from inside a house, with appreciation for the spectacle and gratitude for the glass between herself and it. There was no glass now. He wore no crown for this. She registered that first, before she registered anything else, because it was the detail her mind chose to anchor on rather than the full reality of him. No crown, no formal armor. He wore dark clothing that fit him with the particular precision of things made for a body rather than a title, and his hands were bare, and his face, don't look at his face, was turned slightly away from her as he spoke in low tones to the ritual elder, an ancient she-wolf named Brenna, who moved through the world as though she had already survived everything it might attempt. Lyra took her position at the edge of the serving circle and became, as she had spent 18 years becoming, invisible. The ritual began with sound. Brenna's voice rose in the old tongue, not words Lyra recognized fully, but syllables that resonated in the bones rather than the ears, that found the hollow places in the body and filled them with something that was not quite warmth and not quite dread. The court answered in unison, a low harmonic that pressed against the walls and came back changed. Lyra poured wine into the first cup with steady hands and thought about the temperature of the stone beneath her feet and did not think about the way the sound was doing something to the pressure behind her ribs. Senna, she thought, the name she had given the locked thing inside her, be still. The pressure shifted. It did not still. The ritual moved through its stages with the unhurried authority of something that had been performed 1,000 times and would be performed 1,000 more. Lyra moved through the serving circle, cup to cup, and kept her head down and measured her breathing, and did not look at the center of the room where Kyle stood, with his hands open at his sides and his face arranged in the particular blankness of a man who has learned to perform composure so completely that he has forgotten it is a performance. She was 3 steps from completing the circuit when it happened. She had no warning. That was the thing she would return to later, the complete absence of warning, the way it arrived not as a building wave, but as a sudden immersion, as though the floor had simply ceased to exist beneath her, and she had been in the water before she understood she had fallen. His scent reached her, not the surface of it. She had catalogued the surface of it before, in those distant observations, filed it away as a thing to be noted and avoided. This was underneath. This was what lived beneath the cold authority and the iron restraint beneath the careful distance he maintained between himself and everything that might matter to him. It reached her like something that had been looking for her. Dark amber and winter rain and something she had no name for, something that smelled like the moment before a wolf howls, like the held breath of the whole forest waiting for the sound. Her hand stopped moving. "Don't," she told herself, "don't you dare!" But her body had already decided. Her body had been deciding since the moment she walked into this room, and she had simply been too occupied with the performance of normalcy to notice the verdict being rendered beneath her skin. Senna moved. Not a shift. Nothing so dramatic, nothing so catastrophic. A pressure, a surge, a sudden, desperate straining against the bindings that Lyra felt as a white-hot line of sensation from her sternum to her throat. She had felt Senna press against the binding before, in moments of fear or grief, but never like this. Never with this particular quality of recognition, as though the locked wolf inside her had heard something she had been waiting 18 years to hear and was answering before Lyra could stop her. Lyra set the wine cup down on the nearest surface. She did not look to see if it was the correct surface, and pressed her hand flat against her own sternum, a gesture she disguised as adjusting her serving cloth. The elder's voice paused. In the sudden quiet, Lyra heard her own heartbeat, and then she heard his. She did not understand, at first, what she was hearing. The way the sound of it seemed to come from inside the room, and also from inside her chest simultaneously. The way the rhythm of it was slightly faster than it should have been for a man standing still. She had the healer's gift, the raven blood sensitivity to the bodies of others, but she had never experienced it like this. Never as a tether, a thread of awareness that ran from her sternum to the center of the room and vibrated with information she did not want. He had turned. She knew it before she saw it, the way you know a change in weather before the first drop falls. She felt the shift in the room's attention, the way the 12 ranked wolves adjusted their posture almost imperceptibly, and she knew that the man at the center of the circle was no longer looking at the elder. She looked up. His eyes found hers with a precision that suggested they had not been searching, that they had known exactly where to look. Gray, she thought irrelevantly. They're gray. Not the cold gray of the stone walls, the gray of the sky the moment before it decides what it will become. He was looking at her the way she imagined a man might look at a word he recognized in a language he had been told he could not read, not with desire, not yet, not in any way she could name with that word, with something more unsettling than desire, with the particular expression of a person confronting information that contradicts everything they have built their certainty upon. Brenna said something in the old tongue. The ritual required his response. He did not respond. The silence stretched 1 beat past ceremony, 2 beats past courtesy, into the territory of something that would be remarked upon later in careful, quiet voices. Lyra watched him not respond and felt Senna surge again. Felt the binding crack, not break, but crack. A hairline fracture in 18 years of enforced silence, and the pain of it was extraordinary, and she did not make a sound. "Look away," she told herself. "Look away right now." She looked away. She gathered the empty cups with hands that did not shake. She was proud of that, afterward, the hands that did not shake. And she moved toward the sanctum's side door with the measured pace of a servant completing her duties. And she did not run, and she did not look back, and she told herself that the feeling of his gaze following her across the room was imagination, was the paranoia of a woman who had spent too many years surviving to trust a moment of stillness. She told herself that. She stepped through the door and into the cold corridor beyond, and the door swung shut behind her, and she stood in the dark with her back against the stone and her hand pressed hard against her sternum, where Senna was still straining, still reaching, still answering a call that Lyra had not given her permission to hear. He didn't recognize it, she told herself. He can't. He doesn't know what you are. He doesn't know what any of this means. But she knew what it meant. She had always known, in the locked and buried place where Senna lived, what it would mean when the wolf finally stirred towards someone with that particular quality of certainty. She pressed harder against her own chest, as though she could push the knowledge back down. The binding held. For now, the binding held. But the crack was there. She could feel it, fine as a thread, bright as a fault line. And she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has survived too much to flinch from truth, that the crack would widen. The only question was whether she would be ready when it did. She had been careful for 18 years. 18 years of measured breath, of eyes cast downward, of hands that knew their place and kept to it. 18 years of learning which floorboards creaked and which shadows swallowed a person whole. She had been careful the way only someone who understood the cost of carelessness could be, not as discipline, but as survival, worn so deep into her bones that it had become indistinguishable from her nature. And then, in the span of 3 days, she had touched a dying man in front of witnesses. She had let Cale Stormborn look at her. Truly look, the kind of looking that peeled back layers. And she had not looked away fast enough. She had let Mira see the amber flash behind her eyes, and she had not denied it convincingly enough. Careful, she told herself now, moving through the lower corridor with a basin of cold water balanced against her hip. You are still careful. Nothing has changed. But something had changed. She could feel it. Not in the world outside her skin, but in the locked and aching space beneath her ribs, where Senna pressed and pressed and pressed against her chains. The wolf had been restless before. Now she was frantic, a live coal behind Lyra's sternum, throwing heat into her blood at the most inconvenient moments, flaring brightest whenever she passed a doorway that smelled of storm wind and something darker, something that had no name she was willing to give it. Stop, she told Senna. Stop, reaching for him. Senna did not stop. The corridor bent toward the east wing, and Lyra turned before it could, taking the servants' passage instead. The narrow channel between the walls where the light came in thin and gray, and the air tasted of old stone and mouse dust. She had memorized every alternate route in Shadowmere Keep in her first month here, not because she had expected this, because she had expected something someday, and a body that had survived what hers had survived learned to prepare for the unnamed thing before it arrived. She heard the voices through the wall before she saw the light beneath the door. She should have kept walking. She stopped. The girl is more than she appears. Lord Vane's voice, smooth as poured oil, with the particular quality of a man who had spent decades making dangerous statements sound like observations. I have had Greta watching her. The incident with the Velanthi dignitary cannot be explained away. A pause. The sound of something being set down, glass on stone, deliberate. You're suggesting she's a healer. Kyle's voice, and the effect of it through the wall, was still, a thing her body registered before her mind could intervene. Low and unhurried, with a tension beneath it like a bowstring drawn and held. Not a question, a test. So I'm suggesting she's something she has not declared herself to be. Vane again. In a keep that houses the Alpha King, undeclared abilities are a security concern. At minimum. At minimum. Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone and breathed through her mouth, slow and silent, the way she had learned to breathe when Margot's footsteps had approached her door in the dark. Stand at maximum, Kyle said. Another pause, longer this time. She could picture Vane's face in it, that careful, constructed hesitation that was never actually hesitation at all, but performance. She had watched him perform for months. She knew his rhythms. There is a woman, Ven said, who arrived at the keep's outer gate this morning. She claims to have information about one of our servants. She has asked for an audience. The basin in Lyra's hands had gone cold. She hadn't noticed when. Margot. The name arrived not as thought, but as physical sensation. A contraction behind her sternum, a sudden flooding cold, the particular quality of dread that had a face and a voice and hands she still felt sometimes in the dark. She's here, and she knows, and she's... Now, what kind of information? Kyle's voice had shifted. Barely. A fraction of degree, the way temperature changes in a room when a window opens somewhere distant. She felt it more than she heard it. It's the kind, Vane said carefully, that concerns bloodlines. The cold in her hands spread up her arms. She had always known this moment existed somewhere in her future, had always known that Margot's patience was not mercy but strategy, that the leash her stepmother kept on her was long enough to feel like freedom and short enough to snap her back at will. She had known. She had prepared. She had told herself, in the gray pre-dawn hours when sleep wouldn't come, and Senna's pain was loudest, that she would be ready. She was not ready. Move, she told herself. Move now, while you still can. Her feet did not move, because Kyle spoke again, and what he said rearranged something in the architecture of the moment. Send her away. Silence. The particular silence of a man who had not expected that answer. My lord, Yahweh said send her away. No louder than before, no harder, but the quality of it had changed. The bowstring released, the tension converted into something else entirely. I don't receive unannounced visitors with information about my servants. If she has a legal claim, She may file it through the council's intake process. If she has a grievance, she may wait 3 weeks for the open petition. A beat. If she has something else, she may take it elsewhere. Lyra stood in the dark between the walls and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something she didn't have a name for anymore, because she had stopped needing names for things she'd stopped believing were possible. He doesn't know, she reminded herself. He doesn't know what he's protecting. He doesn't know he's protecting anything at all. But Senna pressed against her chains and made a sound Lyra had no word for. Not a howl, not a whimper, something older than either. And the amber light behind Lyra's eyes bloomed hot and sudden, and she had to close them, had to press her fingers against her lids and breathe and breathe and breathe until it faded. When she opened her eyes, the light beneath the door had shifted. Someone was moving toward it. She moved. She was 3 turns away and descending toward the kitchen level when she heard the door open behind her, heard Vane's measured footsteps in the corridor above, and she did not run. Running was the thing that made you visible. Running was the thing that made you real. She walked, and she kept her basin level, and she kept her breathing even, and she did not let herself think about what had just happened until she was through the kitchen door and standing in the steam and the noise and the familiar, merciful chaos of the place that had been her world for 18 years. Mira found her at the washing basin 20 minutes later, scrubbing the same pot she had already scrubbed clean. "So you heard something?" Mira said. Not a question. Lyra did not look up. "So I hear many things. Is Lyra." Mira's hand settled on her arm, light, careful, the touch of someone who had learned not to startle her. "Your eyes." She stopped scrubbing. She looked down at the water in the basin, at the surface of it trembling slightly from her own hands, and in the distorted reflection she could see what Mira meant. The amber was there, not a flash now, not the brief betrayal of a moment's weakness, but a sustained glow, deep and steady and entirely beyond her control. Senna, pressing upward. Senna, responding to something that Lyra's careful mind was still trying to categorize as nothing. "He sent her away," Senna seemed to say, in the wordless language of pressure and heat. He sent her away without knowing why. "I'm fine," Lyra said. "You're not," Mira said, with the particular gentleness of someone who had stopped believing that particular lie months ago. "And I think you need to tell me what's happening before it happens to you instead of with you." Lyra looked at the water, at the amber light in it, steady as a candle in a windless room. She thought about 18 years of silence. She thought about the weight of it, not the dramatic, story-worthy weight, but the mundane, grinding weight of a secret, carried so long it had fused to the carrier, become load-bearing, become the thing that held the structure up. She thought about what happened to a building when you removed a load-bearing wall. She thought about Cale's voice through the stone, unhurried and absolute. Send her away. He doesn't know, she told herself again. He doesn't know. But her wolf was glowing in the water, and her hands had stopped shaking, and something that had been locked and silent and buried for 18 years was pressing its full weight against its chains. Not in desperation now, but in something that frightened her far more. Certainty. "Sit down," Lyra said quietly. She set the pot aside. She turned to face Mira, and she did not hide her eyes. "So I'm going to tell you something, and when I'm finished, you're going to understand why I need you to forget it immediately." "Shh," she paused. "And then you're going to understand why I can't let you." Mira sat down, and for the first time in 18 years, Lyra opened her mouth and let the truth begin to climb out of the dark. The decree arrived on a Tuesday. Lyra knew this only because Mira had whispered it to her that morning while they hauled water from the lower cistern. Tuesday, the worst possible day, as if the calendar itself had conspired, and she had filed the information away behind her sternum alongside every other thing she was not permitted to feel. The stone corridor had been cold. The bucket had been heavy. She had focused on these facts with the precision of a woman who understood that precision was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. By midday, every servant in Shadowmere Keep knew. She heard it in fragments, the way she heard everything, snatches of conversation through doorways, whispers that died when she entered a room and resumed the moment she left. The Alpha King had received the formal summons from the Council of Elders. The coronation would proceed in 6 weeks, not 7. Lord Vane had announced it at the morning assembly with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering news he had shaped with his own hands. 6 weeks. She set a platter of bread on the long kitchen table and did not drop it. This was the whole of her accomplishment in that moment, and she allowed herself to count it as one. The ritual of the lone crown. She had known of it the way she knew of most things, from the edges of other people's conversations, from the fragments of history she had absorbed in the years before her father died, when she had still been a girl who was permitted to learn things. An alpha king, who stood unmated before the council, would undergo the binding ceremony. He would be sealed to his solitude. The bond capacity would be excised from him as cleanly as a surgeon removes a diseased limb, permanently, irrevocably, with the full weight of ancient law behind the blade. And if a mate bond already existed, half-formed and unrecognized, the excision would not simply remove his capacity. It would sever the tether entirely. She pressed her palms flat against the kitchen table and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, the way she had taught herself to breathe in the years when breathing was the only thing she could control. The bread smelled of yeast and char, the fire in the hearth popped and settled. Somewhere above her, in the great hall, she was not permitted to enter. Lord Vane was likely already congratulating himself. Don't think about the tether. Don't think about what you felt in the corridor 3 days ago when he passed within arm's reach and your wolf, your bound, silent, stone-encased wolf, threw herself against her chains so violently that you had to bite the inside of your cheek to keep from crying out. She had not cried out. She had bowed her head and let him pass and stood very still until the warmth of his proximity faded and Senna subsided back into her aching quiet. She had told herself it meant nothing. She was becoming less convincing. The kitchen filled and emptied around her in the rhythm of the afternoon's work, and Lyra moved through it the way she moved through everything, efficiently, invisibly, with her head down and her hands occupied and her face arranged into the careful blankness that had kept her alive for 18 years. She carried. She cleaned. She did not think about 6 weeks. She thought about the next task, and then the next, and then the one after that, because the present moment was the only territory she could safely occupy. It was Greta who told her she was wanted upstairs. Not asked. Wanted. The distinction mattered, and Greta delivered it with the particular relish of a woman who had learned that cruelty was most effective when delivered in the language of bureaucracy. "So Lord Vane's office," Greta said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. "So immediately. Don't make him wait." Lyra set down the cloth she was holding. She did not ask why. She did not allow her expression to shift. She simply turned and walked toward the stairs, and the only sign of what moved through her was the slight, careful way she kept her hands loose at her sides, fingers uncurled, palms open, because she had learned long ago that clenched fists were a luxury she could not afford. Lord Vane's office occupied a corner of the keep's second level, positioned so that its windows looked out over both the main gate and the training yard. A strategic choice, she had always thought. A room designed for watching. The door was open when she arrived, and she stood in the threshold and waited, because entering without permission was the kind of mistake that left marks. He made her wait 4 minutes. She counted. "Come in," he said finally, without looking up from the documents on his desk. She entered. She stood before him with her hands clasped and her gaze directed at the middle distance. Not quite at his face, not quite at the floor, the precise angle of deference that communicated submission without inviting contempt. She had calibrated this angle over years of practice. Lord Vane was a lean man with careful eyes and the kind of stillness that did not come from peace. He looked up at her the way one looks at an object that has been placed inconveniently in one's path, not with anger, but with the mild, impersonal calculation of a man deciding whether to step around it or remove it entirely. "Tu, the coronation decree," he said, "has been formalized." "Yes, my lord." "You are aware of the ritual of the lone crown." It was not a question. She answered it anyway, because silence was a form of insubordination she could not currently afford. "I have heard it mentioned, my lord." "But then you understand," he said, setting down his pen with the deliberate care of a man who wanted her to watch him do it. "Now that the Alpha King will be required to formally declare his mate's status before the council in 6 weeks' time." He paused. The fire in his grate made a sound like a caught breath. "And you understand that any disruption to that process would be considered an act of treason against the crown." She felt the word land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Disruption. The ripples moved outward, and she held herself very still and let them go. "I am a kitchen servant, my lord," she said. "I have no capacity to disrupt anything." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were the color of old pewter, flat and reflective and giving nothing back. She noticed with the part of her mind that catalogued irrelevant details when the relevant ones became unbearable, that his collar was slightly askew, that the quill on his desk had been chewed at the end, that the window behind him was fogged with cold, and someone had drawn a line through the condensation with one finger, a single deliberate stroke, like the beginning of a word that had been abandoned. See that it stays that way," Lord Vane said. She was dismissed with a gesture, not a word. She turned and walked back through the door and down the corridor and did not allow herself to feel anything at all until she had descended the stairs and turned the corner into the narrow passage that led to the lower kitchen where no one was likely to follow her. And then she stopped. She pressed her back against the stone wall. The cold came through her thin servant's cloth immediately, specific and grounding, and she focused on it. The particular texture of old granite, the way it held the chill of the mountain even in the warmest months, the slight roughness where the mortar had crumbled between the blocks. He knows. Not about the binding. Not about her bloodline or her father, or the name she had buried so deep she sometimes forgot it herself. But he knew that something was wrong with the picture she presented, and he had just delivered a warning dressed in the language of policy. And the warning was this: whatever you are, whatever you think you have, disappear before the coronation, or I will disappear you myself. Senna moved inside her. Not the violent thrashing of 3 days ago. This was something quieter and more terrible. A slow, agonized pressing against the binding, like a hand laid flat against a wall of glass, like a creature that has stopped trying to break through and has begun, instead, simply to grieve. I know, Lyra thought, not in words but in the wordless language of a woman who had been talking to her locked wolf for 18 years. I know. The coronation in 6 weeks. The ritual of the lone crown. Kyle standing before the council, declaring himself unmated, and the ancient law descending like a blade. And somewhere in the tangle of it, the curse she didn't fully understand, the bond she couldn't afford to name, the binding that was already beginning to fracture at its edges every time he came near. Somewhere in all of it was a version of events where she survived. She was having difficulty locating it. She pushed herself off the wall. She straightened her cloth. She tucked the fear back behind her sternum, where it lived alongside everything else she was not permitted to feel. And she walked back toward the kitchen, and she picked up the cloth she had set down, and she continued. This was the whole of her power, and she wielded it with everything she had. Above her, through the stone and the cold, and the 6 weeks that stood between now and the end of something she could not yet name, she heard the distant sound of the keep settling into evening. The creak of old timber, the low call of a guard on the outer wall, the particular silence of a fortress that had been built to withstand everything. She wondered, not for the first time, whether it had been built to withstand her. She had known, in some quiet and terrible corner of herself, that the binding was not permanent. Nothing built on cruelty ever was. But knowing a thing in the abstract and feeling it happen inside your own body were two entirely different kinds of knowledge. And what was happening to Lyra now, in the narrow corridor behind the great hall, while the coronation preparations thundered through the walls like a second heartbeat, was not abstract at all. It was seismic. It was her ribcage becoming a battlefield. Senna, she thought, pressing her back against the cold stone. Senna, stop! Her wolf did not stop. The binding had been cracking for days. She had felt it the way you feel a tooth beginning to loosen, that deep-root ache that announces itself before the damage is visible. Small things at first, the amber flash in her eyes that she could no longer suppress quickly enough. The way her fingertips had begun to tingle when Cale entered a room, as though her body were trying to reach toward him through the air. The dreams, vivid and devastating, of running on 4 legs through snow-covered ground, the wind tasting of iron and freedom, a massive silver-streaked shape running beside her, that she refused to look at directly because looking would mean wanting, and wanting would mean losing everything she had spent 18 years carefully not losing. Now it was more than cracking. Now it was fracturing. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum and felt it, the pressure that had lived behind her ribs for so long she had stopped registering it as pain, the way you stop registering the sound of water when you live beside a river. Except now the river was rising, now the banks were giving way. Senna was pressing against the binding with everything she had. And the binding, that terrible architecture of stolen magic and her stepmother's spite, was answering with a sound Lyra felt rather than heard, a deep, structural groan, like a bridge bearing more weight than it was built for. Not here, she thought. Not now. Please, not now. The coronation was in 4 days. 4 days. And then Kyle would undergo the ritual of the lone crown, and the bond that she could feel stretching between them, The bond she had no name for, no right to, no safe way to hold, would be severed at the root. She had learned this 2 nights ago from Mira, who had pressed the information into her hands like a wound she was sorry to give. The ritual would bind him to solitude, permanently, and if the mate bond existed between them, even unacknowledged, even cursed into silence on his end and bound into silence on hers. She had not let herself finish that thought. She had folded it away somewhere she could not reach, but Senna could reach it. Senna had been reaching for it for days. The pain arrived without warning. A white-hot lance through her left shoulder, down through her spine, blooming outward through her ribs like something trying to unfold that had been folded too long. Lyra bit down on the inside of her cheek and tasted copper and did not make a sound. She had learned, at 16, how to receive pain in silence. Her stepmother had been a thorough teacher. "You will not shift," she told her wolf. "You will not shift in this corridor, in this keep." 4 days before the coronation, with Vane's men watching every shadow and Greta reporting every breath I take. "You will not." Senna did not agree. Senna had been in chains for 18 years, and she was done agreeing. Lyra's knees buckled. She caught herself on the wall, her palm scraping stone, and focused on that small, grounding pain, the physical reality of it, the blood warmth of it, because it was something she could hold on to while the larger thing tried to pull her apart. Her vision fractured at the edges. She could smell the binding now, the way you can smell a fire before you see the smoke. Something acrid and dark, like iron left too long in rain, like magic gone wrong and wrong and wrong for 18 years. And beneath it, beneath the rot of what had been done to her, something else, something that had no right to be there in this corridor, in this moment except that it was. His scent. She had not heard him approach. She never did. He moved like weather, like a change in pressure, rather than a presence. And by the time she registered that he was there, he was already close enough that the warmth of him reached her before his voice did. So Lyra, not girl, not servant. Her name, in his mouth, in that voice that she had spent weeks pretending not to catalog, low and precise, with a roughness underneath it that suggested something carefully controlled. And the sound of it hit the binding like a second fracture point. Senna surged. Lyra made a sound she had not intended to make. Small, involuntary, the kind of sound that escapes before you can catch it, and she hated herself for it immediately, hated the way her body refused to perform the invisibility she had spent 18 years perfecting in his presence, specifically. "Look at me." Not a command. Or, it was a command, but not the kind he gave to warriors, the kind that came from somewhere else in him, somewhere she suspected he didn't fully understand himself. She looked up. He was closer than she'd realized, close enough that she could see the way his jaw had tightened, the way his eyes, gray as winter water, as the moment before a storm decides what it will become, were moving over her face with an attention that felt nothing like the attention of a king cataloging a servant. He looked like a man trying to solve a problem he hadn't been given the right language for. "Don't," she thought. "Don't look at me like you're trying to find me. I am not findable. I am not here. I have not been here for 18 years, and I cannot afford to start now. So you're in pain," so he said. "So I'm fine. So you're lying." She had no answer for that. She was, in fact, lying, and they both knew it. And the binding chose that precise moment to send another wave of fracturing pressure through her chest that she absorbed through sheer, practiced will, her breath going shallow and controlled while her fingers curled against the stone wall and her wolf screamed in a register that no one in this corridor could hear. No one except, perhaps, him. Because something shifted in his expression, a small, seismic thing, barely visible, the kind of change that only registered because she had spent weeks learning the geography of his face against her better judgment. His nostrils flared, his chin lifted slightly, and then something moved behind his eyes that she had no name for, something that looked like recognition fighting its way up through deep water, through years of cursed silence, through the same kind of chains she wore, except his had been forged by someone else's dark magic rather than her stepmother's. He can almost smell it, she realized. He can almost feel it. The bond. His curse is... What is happening to you? His voice had changed. The control in it was still there, but it had shifted, become something less like command and more like... She didn't have the word. She had deliberately not learned the word for what his voice sounded like when it was directed at her with that particular quality of attention. "It's nothing that concerns the Alpha King," she said, and her voice was steady, which was the only victory available to her in this moment. He took one step closer. The scent of him, dark water, struck flint. Something warm underneath that she had spent weeks refusing to name, wrapped around her like a second binding, except this one didn't hurt. This one felt terrifyingly like relief. Senna went very still. The binding groaned. "It's your eyes," he said quietly. She knew without looking. The amber light, Senna's light, the wolf beneath the surface pressing her face against the glass, was visible. She could feel it, the warmth of it behind her own gaze, and there was nothing she could do to suppress it because Senna had stopped cooperating. And the binding was crumbling, and she was standing in a corridor 4 days before the coronation with the Alpha King, close enough to touch, and her entire carefully constructed invisibility coming apart at the seams. Tell him nothing, she told herself. You have survived 18 years. You can survive 4 more days. You can survive this moment. You can survive him. But Senna was pressing against the binding with everything she had, and the binding was answering with that deep structural groan, and Lyra understood, with a clarity that felt like grief, that she was running out of time. Not 4 days, perhaps not even 4 hours. The binding was breaking, her wolf was waking, and the man standing in front of her, the man whose curse had kept him blind to the thing stretching between them like a thread pulled taut across 18 years of silence and survival. He was looking at her with his winter water eyes and his almost recognition, and she was out of walls to press her back against. She had one secret left. She had been keeping it since she was 16 years old. She did not know how much longer she could keep it from him. 4 days, she thought, and it felt less like a plan and more like a prayer. Senna did not answer. Senna was done with prayers. She did not know afterward how long she knelt on the stone floor of the ritual chamber with his blood on her hands. This is what breaking feels like, she thought. And then immediately, no. This is what it feels like when something that was never allowed to live finally refuses to die quietly. The distinction mattered. She needed it to matter. Kyle had not moved. He lay where the ritual of the lone crown had felled him. The ceremony's symbolic death, made briefly, terrifyingly literal, when Vane's corrupted sigils had turned the ancient magic back on itself, when the curse and the ritual had collided inside him like 2 storms meeting over open water. The other witnesses had fled. Van himself had vanished in the chaos, and Margot's name was on every tongue in the corridor, beyond the sealed doors. And none of it, reached Lyra where she knelt. She pressed her palms flat against his chest, felt nothing, then felt everything. The binding inside her had been cracking for days. She understood that now, the way you understand a thing only once it has already happened. Each moment of proximity to him had been a hairline fracture in Margot's 18-year architecture. Each time her pulse had betrayed her, each time Senna had pressed against the chains and found them slightly, imperceptibly looser. The revelation of her bloodline in the court 2 days prior had not broken the binding so much as it had illuminated how broken it already was, how the magic that was meant to silence her had been quietly, steadily losing its grip since the moment Cale Stormborn had walked through Shadowmere Keep's gates and her wolf had recognized what her mind refused to name. But recognition was not the same as release. She needed something more than proximity, more than fracture, more than the slow erosion of a curse by the gravitational pull of a man she was not permitted to want. She needed him to live. Senna, she thought. And it was not a command. She had never been able to command her wolf, had only ever been able to mourn her. It was something closer to a plea. Senna, if you have anything left, if there is anything left of us, now. The response came from somewhere below her sternum. A warmth, first, then a pressure, then a sound she had not heard in 18 years. Not a howl, not yet, but the memory of one, the shape of one, like a word remembered in a language you thought you'd forgotten. Her hands began to glow. She stared at them. She had always known about the warmth, the way her touch brought relief to the sick, the way animals quieted beneath her palms. She had never understood it as power, had never been permitted to understand it as anything other than a strange accident of her diminished nature. But Senna was not diminished. Senna had never been diminished. Senna had been buried alive, and the Raven gift, the healer's gift, the dual shifter's inheritance, had been leaking through the cracks of the binding for years, finding the only outlet Margot's magic had failed to fully seal. The light was amber and silver at once, and it moved like breath. It moved into him. She felt the curse the way you feel a scar. Not pain exactly, but the memory of pain, the shape of an old wound. It lived in the center of him, dense and deliberate, woven through his wolf's senses like a net of black thread, Whoever had cast it had been patient and precise and utterly without mercy. They had not simply blocked the mate bond. They had convinced Torin, the great silver-streaked wolf that lived beneath Kale's skin, that the bond did not exist, that it had never existed, that the restlessness he felt was his own flaw, his own failure, his own proof of unworthiness. Oh, Lyra thought, and the grief of it moved through her like a tide. They made you believe you were broken. She knew that particular wound. She'd worn it for 18 years. Her light pressed against the curse's architecture, and the curse pushed back, cold and deliberate, the magical equivalent of a locked door. She pushed harder. Senna surged beneath her ribs, and for the first time in 18 years, Lyra felt her wolf not as a pressure or an ache or a phantom limb, but as a presence, enormous and warm and furious and entirely, irrevocably hers. The binding shattered, not gradually, not with the slow erosion she had been experiencing for weeks. It shattered the way ice shatters when something massive moves beneath it, a single, catastrophic crack that traveled in every direction at once, and then the whole structure gave way, and Lyra opened her mouth and made a sound. It was not a word. It was not a scream. It was the sound of 18 years of silence ending, and it came from somewhere so deep inside her that she felt it in her teeth, in her spine, in the soles of her feet against the cold stone floor. It rose and became something that the chamber's ancient walls had not heard in a very long time. A wolf's voice, finding the open air. Senna howled through her human throat, and the sound was grief and fury and something that had no name except finally. The curse inside Kale came apart. She felt it happen, felt the black thread net dissolve under the combined force of her healer's light and the mate bond that had been pressing against it from the inside for weeks. Torin's restless pacing finally finding what it had been searching for. The dissolution was not gentle. It moved through Kale's body like a current, and he arched beneath her hands, and his eyes opened. They were amber gold, and they were not entirely human, and they found her face with an immediacy that suggested Torin had taken the wheel. She did not move. She could not have moved if the chamber had caught fire. He stared at her. She watched him breathe, watched his chest rise and fall beneath her still glowing hands, watched the color return to his face, watched the moment when recognition arrived. Not the slow, reluctant recognition of a man noticing a servant who moves strangely, not the guarded, suspicious attention of a king cataloging a threat. This was different. This was the recognition she had read about in the old texts her father had kept, the ones Margot had burned along with everything else, the recognition that happened at the level of the blood, the bone, the wolf, the recognition that said, "You, it was always you. I have been looking for you since before I knew I was looking." His hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his chest. His touch was warm. It was... She searched for a word and found only the inadequacy of all available words. It was like the first breath after nearly drowning, like the moment when your eyes adjust to the dark and you realize the shapes you feared were only furniture, like something returning that you had given up hoping for. Don't, she thought, and the warning was automatic, 18 years of self-preservation rising to the surface. Don't let this be real. Don't let yourself have this. You know what happens when you want things. But Senna was no longer bound. And Senna, it turned out, had opinions. So Lyra, Dr. Gis. His voice was rough with what the ritual had cost him, and with something else, something that moved through the single syllable of her name like a question and an answer simultaneously. He said her name as though he had known it before he learned it, as though it had been waiting in his mouth. She realized she was shaking. "You're alive," she said, and her own voice surprised her. Not the careful, flattened tone she had spent years perfecting, but something raw, something that had not been permitted to exist until approximately 4 minutes ago. I wasn't sure the bond could. I didn't know if the healer's gift was strong enough to... It'll be Lyra. Ooh. He said it again, quieter, and sat up, and she should have moved back, but she didn't. And then he was upright, and she was still kneeling, and his face was very close to hers, and his scent. She had noticed his scent before. She had been noticing it, helplessly, since the first day. But the binding had muffled it the way a closed window muffles rain. She had known it was there, had caught fragments of it, had spent considerable effort not cataloging those fragments. With the binding gone, she cataloged everything, dark amber and cold iron, and something that reminded her of the moment just after lightning strikes. Not the lightning itself, not the thunder, but the charged silence that follows, the air that hums with what just happened. Underneath it, warmer, wood smoke and old stone and something that was simply, specifically, irreducibly him. Something that her wolf recognized the way lungs recognize air. Something that said home in a language older than words. She had not had a home in 18 years. "Shall I consent you?" he said, and his voice held something she had never heard in it before. Not the cold authority, not the careful restraint, but something unguarded and almost wondering. "I couldn't. For 11 years, I couldn't. And now I consent you, and you smell like—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. She watched him search for words and find them insufficient and discard them. "Shall I know?" she said softly. His thumb moved across her knuckles. A small motion, barely intentional, the kind of touch that happens before the mind can intervene and impose caution. She felt it in every nerve ending she possessed. "Don't cry," she told herself. "You have survived 18 years of worse than this. You can survive being seen." But surviving and allowing were different things, and she was only just learning the difference. Outside the sealed doors, she could hear the keep beginning to reassemble itself. Voices, footsteps, the distant sound of Mira calling her name with an urgency that meant the world had not stopped simply because something irrevocable had happened in this chamber. Ven was still somewhere in the corridors. Margot's name was still being spoken. The coronation ritual was still 7 days away, and the law was still the law, and nothing had been resolved. But Kyle's hand was warm around hers, and Senna was awake, and for the first time in 18 years, Lyra Ashenbrand drew a breath that did not hurt. It is not over, she thought with perfect clarity, but it has begun. She had always known this moment would come, not in the way that prophecy arrives, clean and certain, delivered in the voice of something ancient, but in the way that all inevitable things announce themselves, through the slow accumulation of small surrenders, through the body's quiet insistence on truth, even when the mind has learned to lie. She had known it the way she knew the ache behind her ribs each morning, the way she knew the particular weight of silence that had replaced her wolf's voice. She had known it the way prisoners know the sound of approaching footsteps, not with hope, not with dread, but with a kind of exhausted recognition. It is time. The great hall of Shadowmere Keep had never been so full, and it had never been so quiet. They stood in a ring around her, lords and warriors and pack-ranked wolves, their faces arranged in expressions that ranged from hunger to horror to the particular blankness of those who have already decided what they are about to witness. The torchlight moved across their features in waves, and Lyra noticed, in the strange clarity that comes when the body understands it is past the point of ordinary fear, that the shadows between them looked like water, like the hall was slowly filling with something dark and cold and patient. Lord Vane stood nearest the dais, his hands folded in front of him, his expression the careful architecture of a man who has arranged this moment and is now waiting to collect what it owes him. Beside him, half hidden in the crowd's outer ring, stood Greta, Margot's creature, Margot's eyes in this place, and the satisfaction on her face was the most honest thing in the room. Lyra did not look at them for long. She could not afford to spend what remained of her attention on the people who wanted her destroyed. She looked at Kyle. He stood at the center of the dais, and the space around him was different from the space around everyone else, charged, pressurized, as if the air itself had reorganized its loyalties. His face was unreadable in the way that stone is unreadable, but his eyes were not stone. His eyes were on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the accusations Vane had just finished delivering, nothing to do with the words witch and defective and fraud that still hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had not yet decided what it intended to burn. He is waiting, she thought. Not for the verdict, for me. Vane had demanded she shift, had framed it as a test of truth. A defective wolf, he had argued smoothly, would be unable to comply. A witch hiding behind a false claim of curse would be exposed. Either way, he had constructed the demand to destroy her. If she could not shift, she was confirmed as the fraud he'd named her. If she could shift, if the binding had weakened enough, if Senna was strong enough, if the impossible had become possible in the weeks since Kale's proximity had begun to crack the chains her stepmother had forged, then what emerged would not be the small, ordinary she-wolf Lyra had spent 18 years pretending to be. What emerged would be the truth. She felt Senna move inside her. Not the desperate, agonized clawing of the bound, not the sound of something breaking itself against stone, but something slower, something that felt, for the first time in 18 years, like breathing, like a creature that has been held underwater, finally feeling its feet find the riverbed. "I'm here," Senna said, in the language that was not language, that lived below words in the place where the body keeps its oldest knowledge. I have always been here. Lyra's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and felt the coarse fabric of her servant's dress beneath her palms, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she would not be wearing this dress much longer, one way or another. She looked at Kyle one more time. He made the smallest movement, not quite a step forward, not quite a gesture, something that existed in the space between intention and action, visible only because she had spent weeks learning the grammar of how he held himself. It said, "I am here. Whatever comes, I am here." She closed her eyes. The binding had been forged in pain and spite and the particular dark magic that feeds on a child's terror. Margot had pressed her hands to Lyra's throat and spoken words that tasted like iron and ash, and the wolf inside the 16-year-old girl had screamed once, a sound that shook the walls of the room where it happened, and then gone silent. Lyra had felt the silence fall like a door slamming shut. She had felt it every day since. She felt it now as something different. She felt it as a door that had been, slowly and without her permission, unlocked. Senna, she thought, not a command, a permission. The pain came first, because it always does. The body's reminder that transformation is not metaphor, that becoming requires the willingness to unmake what you were. It moved through her like a wave of heat, like the moment before a fever breaks, and she heard herself make a sound that was not quite human and not quite wolf, and was perhaps something that had never been heard in this hall before. Then the binding shattered. She felt it go, felt the specific, impossible sensation of a chain that has been embedded in bone suddenly releasing, and the sound it made inside her was not a crack or a snap, but something lower, something that resonated in the frequency below hearing, and she saw, through the tears that had come without her choosing them, the lords and warriors take a collective step backward. Senna rose. She rose the way light rises, not all at once, but in layers, each one brighter than the last, until the brightness is the only thing. Lyra felt her body reshape itself with a grace she had forgotten was possible, felt her spine arc and her hands find the stone floor and her senses, her true senses, the ones that had been locked away for 18 years, open like a window thrown wide in a room that has been sealed too long. The scent of the hall hit her first, tallow and cold stone and the sharp mineral edge of fear from the assembled wolves, and beneath all of it, threading through everything, the scent that had been pulling at her since the day Kale walked through the gates of Shadowmere Keep. Rain-soaked iron and something ancient and warm, like embers in a hearth that has never been allowed to go fully cold. Her wolf knew that scent. Her wolf had always known it. She heard someone in the crowd make a sound, not a word, something older than words, and she understood, dimly, that they were seeing something they had not expected. The dual form. She had known it was there. In the abstract way, she had known all the things about herself that the binding had buried. The raven blood of the Ashenbrand line, the second nature that ran alongside the wolf like a shadow alongside a body. She had never felt it manifest. She felt it now in the shimmer at the edges of her fur. Dark feathers, threaded through gray, iridescent where the torchlight caught them, as if her coat could not quite decide what it was and had chosen to be both. Her paws were large, larger than a standard she-wolf's, and her eyes, she knew without seeing them, burned with the amber gold of the wolf and the black mirror depth of the raven simultaneously. She was, in this form, exactly what her bloodline had always promised she would be. She was, in this form, impossible to dismiss. The silence in the hall was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Then Kal moved. He came down from the dais without ceremony, without the performance of authority that she had watched him deploy in every formal moment she had witnessed. He came down the way a person moves towards something they have been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting, with a directness that bypassed every other consideration in the room. She watched him come, this king who had been cursed to never recognize his mate, and she felt Senna go absolutely still inside her. "He knows," Senna said, in the not language. "He knows now." He stopped 3 feet from her. She could hear his heartbeat, could hear it the way she could hear her own, the way the body hears the things it has decided matter. And it was not the steady, controlled rhythm of the cold king. It was the heartbeat of a man standing at the edge of something that has just become real. He lowered himself to one knee, not in submission, not in the formal gesture of pack deference, in something older than pack law, older than the titles and the rituals and the careful architecture of power that had governed every interaction between them. He lowered himself to her eye level, and his face was open in a way she had never seen it, and his eyes, those winter gray eyes that she had spent weeks refusing to look at directly, held something that she had no word for in any language she had been permitted to learn. Recognition, Senna said softly. That is what recognition looks like. Lyra held very still. She was still wolf, still feather-edged and trembling with the newness of her own form, and she was aware of the entire hall watching, aware of Vane's silence and Greta's silence and the silence of every wolf who had come here expecting to witness a destruction. What they were witnessing instead was a beginning. Kyle raised one hand, slowly, the way you move toward a wild thing you do not want to startle, and held it open between them. Not a command, not a claim, an offering. She pressed her nose to his palm. His breath left him in a sound that was not quite a word, and she felt the mate bond, the real one, the one his curse had hidden from him for 11 years, flare between them like a match struck in a dark room. Sudden, irreversible, entirely, devastatingly true. There it is, she thought, in the voice that was hers alone. There we are. She did not know what she expected the end of silence to feel like. She had imagined it sometimes, in the small hours of the kitchen when the fires burned low and the keep settled into its nighttime breathing. Imagined what it might mean to be unhidden, to be known, to stand in full light without flinching. She had imagined relief. She had imagined grief. She had imagined something clean and final, like a blade drawn across a rope. She had not imagined this. The great hall of Shadowmere Keep, every torch blazing, every eye upon her, and Cale Stormborn on his knees. Don't, she thought, the word rising, helpless and too late. Don't kneel for me, I don't know how to hold that. But he was already there, and the stone floor was cold beneath him, and he did not look like a man performing submission. He looked like a man who had finally, after 11 years of searching in the wrong direction, found north. The hall was not silent. It had been for the span of 3 heartbeats after the dual shift, after the wolf and the raven had torn free of her at last, after Senna had thrown back her head and released the howl that Lyra had swallowed for 18 years, after the black wings had unfurled and the amber light had cracked through every binding Margot had ever forged. It had been utterly, completely silent, the silence of a world reconsidering itself. Then the noise had come, lords and ladies scrambling backward, warriors reaching for weapons they did not draw. Lord Vane's voice, sharp and wrong, cutting through the chaos. Witch. She is a witch. Seize her. And Margot, who had come to watch Lyra destroyed, who had stood at the edge of the crowd with satisfaction already settled into the lines of her face, Margot had gone the color of old ash when the raven form rose above the wolf, when the dual shift made itself undeniable, when 18 years of stolen power began to unravel in a single, luminous moment. Kyle had not reached for a weapon. He had not retreated. He had stood in the center of the chaos, like a stone in a river, watching Lyra return to herself, the wolf receding, the wings folding, her human form reassembling from light and breath and the long-suppressed truth of her blood. And something in his face had broken open, not shattered, opened, the way a window opens, suddenly and with the smell of outside rushing in. He had crossed the hall in 12 strides. He had gone to his knees before she could speak. Now she stood above him, trembling, not from fear, not any more, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of being seen. And her wolf was quiet inside her for the first time in 18 years. Not bound, not silenced, quiet. The way a thing is quiet when it has finally arrived where it was always going. Senna, she thought, and felt the wolf lift her head and answer, warm and real and present. We made it. Shalira Ashenbrand. Dia. Kyle's voice filled the hall without effort, without performance. It was not the voice of a king making a declaration. It was the voice of a man saying a name he had not known he was missing. A daughter of the Ashenbrand line, dual shifter. True mate T. The last 2 words landed differently than the others. They landed in her chest, behind her ribs, in the exact place where the binding had lived for so long that she had forgotten what the space was for. He knows, she thought. The curse, how does he? The curse broke, he said, as if he had heard her, and perhaps he had. Perhaps the mate bond, fully recognized now, carried sound as well as scent. He looked up at her, and his eyes were not the winter gray she had catalogued from a careful distance for weeks. They were amber, his wolf's color, bleeding through. When you shifted, when Senna howled. A pause, brief and weighted. I heard it. For the first time in 11 years, I heard what my wolf has been trying to tell me. She became aware, distantly, that her hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs and felt the rough weave of the servant's cloth, gray, worn thin at the knees, the uniform of her diminishment. And something about the contrast of that fabric against this moment made her eyes sting. Don't cry, she told herself. Not here. Not in front of all of them. But Kyle rose from his knees before the tears could decide, and he was close, closer than he had ever permitted himself to be, closer than she had ever allowed herself to want. And his scent reached her at last, without the muffling effect of the binding's interference. She had caught edges of it before, fragments that her suppressed wolf could not fully process. Rain on stone, the air before a storm breaks. Now she understood what had lived beneath those edges. Warm iron, ancient wood, something that smelled, impossibly, like the moment just before dawn, when the dark has not yet released its hold, but the light is already inevitable. Oh, she thought. Just that. Oh. You have been in this keep for 7 weeks, he said, and his voice was low now, meant only for her, despite the hundreds watching. You have been in front of me, and I could not. The curse would not let me. Eve. He stopped. He was not a man accustomed to incomplete sentences. The effort of this one showed in the line of his jaw. I owe you an accounting that will take longer than this hall will permit. You owe me nothing. The words came out before she could examine them. Her voice was rough from the howl, from 18 years of careful quiet, from the shock of using it at full volume for the first time. 'Cause you didn't know. If I should have known. His hand rose. She tracked the movement with the hyper-awareness of someone who had spent years cataloging threats, and stopped just short of her face, not touching, asking. May I? The question undid her more than any declaration could have. This man, who could command armies, who could silence a room with his stillness, who had spent 11 years armored against the very possibility of this moment. Asking. May I? She nodded because her voice had temporarily abandoned her. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and where it passed, she felt the mate bond sing, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. She felt it the way she felt her own heartbeat, present, rhythmic, undeniable, a warmth that began at the point of contact and moved through her like the first swallow of something hot on a cold morning, reaching places she had not known were frozen. Senna pressed forward in her chest, not straining against a binding, but simply leaning, the way a wolf leans into a hand it trusts. Storin has been trying to reach her for weeks, Kyle said, and there was something almost wondering in his voice, the tone of a man discovering that the map he has been using is wrong in ways that make the territory more beautiful, not less. So every time you entered a room, every time you walked past, he knew what I couldn't. Senna knew, too. She found her voice again, small but steady. She couldn't tell me. She couldn't tell me anything. But she knew. Behind them, the hall was reorganizing itself. She heard Lord Vane's voice again, higher now, insistent. The law, the ritual, the lone crown ceremony must proceed, and heard it cut off with a single word from one of Kale's senior warriors. She heard Margot make a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a scream. She heard Mira, somewhere near the back of the crowd, release a breath that sounded like it had been held for 7 weeks. She did not turn to look at any of it. She could not look away from him. The ritual of the lone crown cannot proceed, Kale said, and now his voice carried again, pitched for the room, for the record, for the law that had been waiting to swallow him. The bond is recognized, the mate is named. His eyes did not leave hers. Lyra Ashenbrand is my mate. Any challenge to that recognition will be answered by both of us. Both of us. She turned the words over, feeling their weight, their novelty. She had been singular for so long, alone in her hiding, alone in her pain, alone in the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who did not know her name. Both of us was a different kind of country. She did not yet know its geography. She thought she might like to learn it. There are things I haven't told you, she said quietly, because she was done with concealment, and the relief of that was almost frightening in its totality. It's about my father, about Margot, about what was done to me and why. You should know all of it before. I know enough. His hand curved around her jaw, and she let it, and Senna made a sound inside her that was not quite a howl and not quite a sigh, but something that belonged to the space between. I know what was taken from you. I know what it cost you to survive it. I know that you stood in my hall for 7 weeks with your wolf bound and your name buried, and you did not break. Something moved through his expression. Not softness exactly, but the place where softness lives in a man who has forgotten its address. For the rest, you will tell me, and I will listen, and then we will decide together what comes next. Together. Another new country. She breathed in his scent, rain on stone, iron, the inevitable dawn, and felt Senna settle fully into her bones for the first time, not straining, not aching, not pressing against a wall that no longer existed. Just there, warm and wild and entirely hers. Outside, through the high windows of the great hall, a single raven called. She did not swallow the sound that rose in her throat in answer. She let it come, not a howl, not yet, not here in this hall full of watching eyes, but something smaller and just as true. A sound she had not made in 18 years, the sound of a wolf who has found, at last, that she is allowed to speak. Kyle heard it. His eyes went amber all the way through. And in the silence that followed, the good kind of silence, the kind that holds rather than suppresses, Lyra Ashenbrand, daughter of a lost bloodline, keeper of a bound wolf, servant and survivor and secret, finally, irrevocably let herself be found.